Welcome to my channel.
The January wind was a spiteful thing, whistling through the cracks of the police station in Loch Dhu with a sound like a piper mourning a lost drama. Outside, the Sutherland Mountains were draped in a heavy, suffocating mist that turned the sea to the colour of wet lead. Inside, PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite winter pastime, pretending to be out. He sat by the ancient peat stove, his lanky frame draped over a wooden chair that had seen better decades. A thick mug of coffee, black as a Highland night and twice as bitter, sat steaming on the armrest. Beside him, Lugs, his dog of indeterminate and frankly suspicious ancestry, let out a long, shuddering sigh. "I know, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice a soft, melodic burr. "If we sit very still, the world might just forget we're here, and then we can go down to the river and see if that big silver fellow is still hiding under the bridge." The big silver fellow was a salmon that Hamish had been stalking with the patience of a saint and the ethics of a professional poacher. Unfortunately, the peace of the Highlands was currently being dismantled by the arrival of the Sassenach contingency at St. Mary's, a private, high-end convalescent home that had recently opened on the outskirts of the village. A Mr. Geoffrey Ponsonby Smythe, a man who possessed a chin like a shovel and a voice that could peel paint, ran the home. He had arrived in Loch Dhu 3 months ago, loudly complaining about the lack of high-speed connectivity and the distressing absence of a decent avocado. He treated the locals like slow-witted extras in a historical pageant, and in return the village had granted him the highest Highland insult. They were perfectly, chillingly polite to his face while ignoring every word he said. The telephone on the desk let out a sharp, demanding jangle. Hamish looked at it with the weary sadness one might reserve for a dying relative. He let it ring 6 times before lifting the receiver. "Loch Dhu Police," he said, sounding as though he had just been roused from a deep, multi-year slumber. "Macbeth, is that you?" The voice was high-pitched and vibrating with hysteria. It was Ponsonby Smythe. "You must come at once. It's a disgrace. A complete breakdown of order." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes focusing on a fly crawling slowly up the window pane. Now, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe. If it's about the sheep on your lawn again, I've told you, they have a traditional right of way. It's not the sheep, you Highland clod. It's Nurse Higgins. She's pretty dead, and in the most appalling location. The reputation of St. Mary's is at stake." Hamish straightened up, his lazy expression remaining fixed like a mask, even as his mind began to sharpen. Nurse Higgins, known to the village as the Dragon of the Ward, was a woman who had managed to offend nearly everyone in Loch Dhu with her relentless efficiency and her habit of telling the local men that their pipes smelled of decaying compost. "Dead, you say?" Hamish asked, already reaching for his cap. "And where exactly would this appalling location be?" "The industrial laundry steamer," Ponsonby Smythe shrieked. "She's been pressed. It's ghastly, Macbeth. Do something." Hamish sighed, the dream of the salmon vanishing into the mist. "I'll be right there. Don't touch anything, especially not the steam valves." He hung up and looked at Lugs. The dog looked back, ears drooping. A murder at the big house meant only one thing. Detective Chief Inspector Blair would be arriving from Strathbane, with his sirens blaring and his temper at boiling point. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, pulling on his heavy greatcoat, "it looks like our quiet day has been pressed and folded. Let's go see what the Sassenachs have done to the dragon." The drive to St. Mary's was a short, bone-rattling journey in the old Land Rover. The vehicle groaned as it climbed the winding track through the heather, its heater blowing nothing but a lukewarm suggestion of air. Hamish kept his eyes on the road, though his thoughts were already sifting through the meagre facts. St. Mary's was an imposing Victorian structure that had once been a hunting lodge, now repurposed into a sanctuary for wealthy elderly patients who wished to spend their final days surrounded by Highland scenery, provided that scenery was viewed through double-glazed windows. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, the mist seemed to thicken, clinging to the grey stone walls like a damp shroud. Lugs let out a low, mournful cry as they stepped out into the biting cold. At the front entrance stood Geoffrey Ponsonby Smith, his face the colour of curdled milk and his silk tie askew. He looked as though he were personally offended that someone had the audacity to die on his watch without filling out the proper requisition forms. Finally, Ponsonby Smith barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. I've had to sequester the staff in the dining hall. The patients are agitated. It's a total catastrophe. Hamish nodded vaguely, his gaze wandering toward the auxiliary building that housed the kitchens and laundry. The laundry room, you said? Show the way, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe, and try to keep your voice. We wouldn't want to be giving the residents any unnecessary excitement. They walked through a sterile corridor that smelled of industrial lavender and floor wax. Ponsonby Smythe led him to the rear of the facility, where a heavy metal door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air was uncomfortably warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp wool and a faint metallic tang that Hamish recognized all too well. The laundry room was a cavernous space filled with humming dryers and massive stainless steel machines. In the center of the room sat the industrial steam press, a formidable piece of equipment designed to flatten bedsheets with terrifying efficiency. It was currently hissed into silence, but the upper plate was locked firmly down. Protruding from the side of the heavy metal plates were a pair of sturdy, sensible nursing shoes and 2 ankles clad in thick white support stockings. Nurse Higgins had been a large, formidable woman, but the machine had reduced her to a horrifyingly two-dimensional state. On top of the closed press sat a single, perfectly starched nursing cap, placed with a precision that felt deeply mocking. Hamish circled the machine, his hazel eyes missing nothing. The control panel showed that the safety override had been engaged from the outside. He didn't need a medical degree to know that the dragon had been dead before the press descended. There was no sign of a struggle, no frantic clawing at the steel. It was a clean, clinical, and utterly humiliating execution. "Who found her?" Hamish asked, his voice low as he knelt to inspect the floor near the safety switch. "Mrs. Wallace, the head housekeeper," Ponsonby Smythe whispered, clutching his chest. "She came in to start the morning linens and found that. She's currently in the kitchen being treated for shock and a sudden urge to resign." Hamish noticed a small damp patch on the floor, not of blood but of something green and sticky, like a crushed mint leaf. He stood up, dusting his knees, his face once again a mask of vacuous calm. To the frantic manager, Hamish looked like he was struggling to grasp the situation, but internally the constable was noting the timing. The laundry room was usually empty between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning. "It's a terrible thing," Hamish said, sounding almost sleepy, "to be ended by the very sheets you spent your life changing. It has a certain symmetry to it." "Symmetry?" Ponsonby Smythe hissed. "It's murder, you fool! And look at that cap. Someone is making a statement." Hamish nodded slowly. "Aye, a statement. But the Highlands have many voices, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe. Some of them don't like being told how to starch a collar." The sound of a heavy vehicle skidding on the gravel outside interrupted them. A moment later, the shrill, familiar scream of a police siren echoed through the stone hallways. Hamish sighed, adjusting his cap. The professional investigators from Strathbane had arrived, and with them would come the bluster, the insults, and the inevitable cloud of cigarette smoke that followed Detective Chief Inspector Blair like a personal thunderstorm. He looked at Lugs, who was sniffing a basket of unfinished laundry with great suspicion. "Stay back, boy," Hamish warned. "The big guns are here to tell us how little we know." The heavy thud of car doors slamming preceded the entrance of the Strathbane police like the opening salvos of a siege. A moment later, Detective Chief Inspector Blair burst into the laundry room, his face a vivid, pulsating shade of magenta that suggested his blood pressure was currently in a race with his temper. He was followed by his usual retinue of weary-looking subordinates, but Blair's presence filled the humid space, pushing aside what little air was left. He stopped dead in front of the steam press, his small, piggish eyes widening as they took in the sensible shoes and the mocking nursing cap perched atop the machinery. "God's sake, Macbeth!" Blair roared, the sound echoing off the tiled walls. "I left you alone for 5 minutes in this godforsaken mist, and you managed to let a nurse get turned into a bloody pancake. What in the name of the crown have you been doing? Sleeping on the job as usual?" Hamish leaned back against a stack of clean towels, his expression one of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. "I was just observing the scene, sir, waiting for the experts to arrive. It's a delicate matter, as you can see." "Delicate?" "It's a shambles." Blair stepped toward the press, nearly tripping over lugs. He let out a curse and aimed a half-hearted kick at the dog, who nimbly dodged behind Hamish's legs. "And get that mongrel out of a crime scene. This isn't a Highland croft. It's a murder investigation. Not that you'd know the difference, you great red-headed streak of nothing." Blair turned his attention to Ponsonby Smythe, who was cowering near the dryers. "You, the manager. Who's the local troublemaker? Who's the drunkard with a grudge against the medical profession? Don't tell me it was an accident. No one accidentally starches their own head. I want names, and I want them before the press finds out a Sassenach business is killing its staff." "Well, sir," Ponsonby Smythe stammered, "there is a local man, a former groundskeeper we sacked last month. Archie McLean. He was quite vocal about the firm hand Nurse Higgins used when managing the staff. He threatened to flatten her more than once, though we assumed it was mere Highland hyperbole." Blair's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a man who saw a quick arrest and an early dinner. "Archie McLean, eh? A disgruntled peasant with a motive. It's perfect. He probably snuck in through the service door, knocked the old girl out, and let the machinery do the rest. Simple, effective, and exactly the kind of thuggery I expect from this village." Hamish cleared his throat softly, a sound so modest it was almost invisible. "Pardon me, sir, but the service door has a double deadbolt that can only be opened from the inside after midnight, and Archie McLean has been in the Loch Dhu Hotel's bar since yesterday afternoon. Mrs. McLean says he's been so drunk he couldn't flatten a pancake, let alone a head nurse." Blair spun around, his finger trembling as he pointed it at Hamish's chest. "Are you cross-examining me, Macbeth? I didn't ask for your input on the local drinking habits. I'm the DCI, and if I say McLean is our man, then he's our man until I find a better one. Now, get out of my sight. Go play with your dog and stay out of the way of real police work. My team will handle the forensics while I go give this McLean fellow a piece of my mind." Hamish didn't argue. He watched as Blair's team began to clumsily dust the stainless steel for prints, knowing full well that in a laundry room filled with steam and condensation, they'd find nothing but smudges. He tipped his cap to the fuming inspector and whistled for lugs. As he walked back through the sterile corridors of St. Mary's, Hamish's mind wasn't on the drunken Archie McLean. It was on the single nursing cap that had been placed so precisely on the machine. It wasn't the act of a drunkard in a rage, it was the act of someone who appreciated order, someone who wanted everyone to know exactly who was lying under that press. He needed to find out who Nurse Higgins had been ordering around lately. And in Loch Dhu, there was only one way to get the real story. He had to go mooching. He needed a cup of tea, a sympathetic ear, and a long walk through the village gossip mill. Hamish beat a hasty retreat from the laundry room, his ears still ringing with the echoes of Blair's shouted insults. As he stepped out into the freezing Highland air, the mist had begun to swirl in thick, ghostly ribbons around the stone turrets of St. Mary's. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail held low as he navigated the slushy gravel. Hamish knew that while Blair was busy terrorizing the local drunks, the real secrets of the nursing home were likely being discussed over steaming pots of tea in the warmer corners of Loch Dhu. He didn't head for the police station. Instead, he steered the Land Rover toward the village centre, pulling up outside the post office. The post office was the nervous system of Loch Dhu, and Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was its primary censor. She was a woman who could read the mood of the village by the way a person licked a stamp. As Hamish entered, the bell gave a cheerful tinkle that felt entirely at odds with the grim scene he had just left. Mrs. Kennedy was already leaning over the counter, her eyes sharp with the thrill of a fresh tragedy. "Is it true, Hamish?" she whispered before he could even close the door. "The dragon of the ward pressed like a Sunday tablecloth. They say the steam was so hot it turned her stockings to liquid." Hamish sighed, leaning against the counter in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world and very little brain power to use it. "It's a terrible business, Mrs. Kennedy. A very tidy crime, if you take my meaning. Not a hair out of place except for the poor woman herself." "Tidy?" Mrs. Kennedy snorted, reaching under the counter for a tin of shortbread. "That sounds like the work of someone who's had to clean up after her. She was a terror, that one. Did you know she had the young kitchen maid Mary in tears every day because the girl's apron wasn't white enough? And then there's the matter of the missing chocolates." Hamish reached for a piece of shortbread, his eyes looking dreamy. "Chocolates, you say? That doesn't sound like a motive for pressing." "It's the principle, Hamish. Nurse Higgins was a thief of little things. She'd confiscate sweets from the elderly patients, claiming it was for their health, and then eat them herself in the staff room. But it wasn't just sweets. Old Mr. Henderson told his daughter that his gold cufflinks had gone missing, and when he complained to Higgins, she threatened to have him moved to the restricted wing." Hamish chewed slowly, his mind filing away the information. A petty thief with a streak of cruelty. That made for a lot of enemies, but it still didn't explain the theatrical nature of the murder. He moved on from the post office to the Lochdu Hotel, where the smell of peat smoke and roasting mutton offered a more substantial comfort. He found Mrs. McLean, the proprietor, polishing glasses with a grim determination. "Blair's been here," she said shortly, nodding toward the back room where the muffled sounds of an interrogation, mostly Blair shouting and someone sobbing, could be heard. "He's got poor Archie McLean in the snug, trying to make him admit he snuck into St. Mary's. The boy can barely stand, Hamish. He was here all night, and I've the bar tab to prove it." "I know, Mrs. McLean," Hamish said softly, accepting a mug of tea. "But Blair likes a culprit who fits the boots. Tell me, who else at that nursing home had a reason to want the dragon gone? Someone with a bit more precision than Archie." Mrs. McLean leaned in, her voice dropping to a low hiss. "Watch new Dr. Hamish, Dr. Cartwright, an Englishman with a very expensive car and a very short temper. Higgins was always correcting him in front of the patients. A man like that doesn't like being told he's wrong by a nurse, especially one who knows more about the medicine than he does. There was a row last week, something about a wrong prescription. People said Higgins was going to the medical board." Hamish sipped his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. A doctor with a reputation to protect and a nurse who held his career in her starched hands. It was a much better fit than a drunken groundskeeper. But as he looked out the window at the thickening snow, he saw a sleek, silver Mercedes pull up at the village's only petrol pump. Out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored coat, looking down at the muddy pavement with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Is that him?" Hamish asked. "That's Cartwright," Mrs. McLean confirmed. "And look at him, not a care in the world while poor Higgins is lying flat in Strathbane." Hamish stood, whistling for lugs. He had mooched enough for one morning. He had a petty thief, a humiliated doctor, and a village full of people who were glad the dragon was dead. Now he needed a perspective from someone who understood the social climbing of the upper-class Sassenachs. He needed Priscilla. The silver Mercedes pulled away from the pump with a spray of slush that narrowly missed Hamish's boots, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive exhaust and even more expensive arrogance. Hamish watched the car disappear into the grey curtain of the Highland mist before turning toward the Tommel Castle estate. He knew that if he wanted to understand the tangled hierarchy of St. Mary's, he needed more than village gossip. He needed the razor-sharp insight of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Priscilla, the daughter of the local gentry, moved through the world of the wealthy Sassenachs, with an effortless grace that allowed her to see exactly what they were trying to hide. He found her in the castle's conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary where the orchids looked far more comfortable than any human in this weather. Priscilla was dressed in a soft cashmere sweater, a book forgotten on her lap as she stared out at the white-capped peaks. She looked up as Hamish entered, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over stone. "A steam press? It's a bit theatrical, even for Lochdu. I assume Blair is currently trying to arrest the local blacksmith or perhaps a stray sheep." Hamish pulled off his cap and sat in a wicker chair that creaked under his weight. "He's got his sights on Archie McLean at the moment, but the shoes don't fit the man, Priscilla. It's a clean job, professional. I heard Dr. Cartwright and Nurse Higgins were at each other's throats over a prescription error." Priscilla set her book aside and leaned forward, her eyes sharpening. "Dr. Julian Cartwright is a man who built his career on a foundation of carefully maintained perfection. He didn't come to Lochdu for the fresh air, Hamish. He came here because his private practice in London was quietly reorganized after a malpractice suit that never quite made the papers. If Nurse Higgins was threatening to go to the board, she wasn't just correcting him, she was holding a match to his entire future." "Is that so?" Hamish mused, his hazel eyes appearing vacant while his mind whirred. "And what about Ponsonby Smythe? He seemed more worried about his reputation than the fact that his head nurse had been turned into a pancake." "Geoffrey is a social climber who has reached the limit of his tether," Priscilla remarked dryly. "He's deeply in debt. St. Mary's is his last chance to stay afloat. But there is someone else you should consider. Have you met the new matron, Mrs. Beaumont? She arrived just 2 weeks ago. She's quiet, efficient, and carries herself like a woman who has spent her life in the military. She and Higgins were often seen whispering in the hallways, not amicably." Beaumont replaced the previous matron, who was Higgins' close friend. There was a rumour that Higgins was trying to blackmail Beaumont out of the position to get her friend back. Hamish nodded slowly, digesting the information. A disgraced doctor, a desperate manager, and a matron with a military bearing and a potential blackmail problem. The dragon had been breathing fire in too many directions at once. "You see, Hamish," Priscilla continued, standing up to adjust a wilting orchid, "the upper class in places like St. Mary's don't kill out of passion. They kill out of a need for order, to remove a blemish from the record. The steam press wasn't just a murder, it was a cleaning. Whoever did it felt they were simply tidying up a mess." "Tidying up," Hamish repeated softly. He thought of the green, sticky smudge he had seen on the floor and the perfectly placed nursing cap. It was too tidy, too deliberate. He stood up, whistling for Lugs, who had been trying to decide if an orchid was edible. "Thank you, Priscilla, you've given me a great deal to chew on. Be careful, Hamish," she shouted as he reached the door. "People who value order above all else don't like it when someone starts digging through the dust." Hamish stepped back out into the cold, his mind fixed on that green smudge. It didn't look like medicine, and it certainly wasn't laundry detergent. He needed to get back to St. Mary's, but not through the front door. He needed to see what the tidy people did when they thought no one was watching. Blair would be busy with his interrogation until sunset, which gave Hamish just enough time to do a bit of unofficial housekeeping of his own. The Land Rover's engine gave a final rattling cough as Hamish pulled back into the gravel drive of St. Mary's. He could see Blair's police van parked crookedly near the front steps, and the distant sound of the DCI's voice, muffled by stone walls but still carrying its distinctive tone of aggressive certainty, echoed across the lawn. Blair was obviously pulling a confused and still reeling Archie McLean toward the vehicle. The poor groundskeeper looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide, his cap pulled low over his eyes as Blair shoved him along, shouting about forensic timelines and confessions by dawn. Hamish didn't intervene. He knew that trying to talk sense into Blair during a moment of perceived triumph was like trying to whistle against a gale. Instead, he whistled softly to Lugs and skirted around the side of the main building, heading toward the staff entrance near the greenhouses. If Priscilla was right about the need for order, And if Mrs. Kennedy's gossip about the missing trinkets held water, the laundry room wasn't the only place where a blemish had been removed. He slipped inside, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the linoleum. The facility was eerily quiet now, the residents tucked away for their afternoon rest, and the staff still huddled in the dining hall under the watchful eye of one of Blair's constables. Hamish made his way back toward the laundry room, but his destination was the small, cramped office used by the head nurse and the matron. It was a room that smelled of starch, peppermint, and secrets. The door was locked, but a man who can poach a salmon from a guarded estate has little trouble with a standard office bolt. Inside, the room was a masterpiece of clinical precision. 2 desks sat facing each other. One belonged to the late Nurse Higgins, cluttered with confiscated sweets and a mountain of disciplinary forms. The other belonged to Mrs. Beaumont, the new matron. Beaumont's desk was terrifyingly bare, save for a single blotter and a small green bottle of industrial-strength plant food for the conservatory orchids. Hamish's eyes sharpened. He remembered the green, sticky smudge on the laundry room floor. He leaned down and peered at the underside of Mrs. Beaumont's desk. Stuck to the mahogany was a small, discarded piece of chewing gum, the exact same shade of minty green as the plant food. Beside it, tucked into a hidden crevice of the desk's frame, was something else, a small gold cufflink with the initials AH etched into the metal. "Old Mr. Henderson's missing gold," Hamish whispered to Luggs. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned his attention to a small wastebasket. Inside, beneath a layer of shredded memos, he found a discarded pair of surgical gloves. They appeared clean at first glance, but when Hamish held them up to the light, he saw the faint, rectangular indentation of the steam press's safety handle. At that moment, the heavy tread of Blair's boots sounded in the hallway. "Macbeth, I know you're lurking in here somewhere." Hamish quickly dropped the gloves back into the bin and assumed his most vacant, simple-minded expression just as the door flew open. Blair stood there looking flushed and victorious. "I've got him, Macbeth. McLean's in the van. He hasn't confessed yet, but once I get him to Strathbane and show him the pictures of that press, he'll be singing like a choir boy." "What are you doing in the matron's office? Looking for a biscuit?" "I was just wondering about the timing, sir," Hamish said, his voice slow and thick with a faint Highland fog. "You see, Archie McLean has a very bad hip. He can barely climb the stairs at the hotel, let alone hoist a woman of Nurse Higgins's considerable stature into an industrial press. It's a very high reach, sir, very high indeed." Blair's face soured. "Adrenaline. It's a well-known scientific fact that criminals gain the strength of 10 men when they're in a murderous rage. Now stop trying to ruin my collar with your peasant logic. We're leaving." "Of course, sir," Hamish said, stepping aside, "but before you go, you might want to ask the matron why she has Mr. Henderson's gold cufflinks tucked under her desk. It seems a strange place for a woman of such military order to be keeping the residents' jewellery." Blair froze, his small eyes darting to the desk. "Jewellery? What are you talking about?" Hamish pointed a long, lazy finger toward the hidden crevice. As Blair bent down to investigate, his face turning an even deeper shade of purple, Hamish looked toward the door. Mrs. Beaumont was standing there, her face a mask of pale, frozen fury. She wasn't looking at Blair, she was looking at Hamish, and for the first time the stupid policeman saw the cold, calculated darkness of a woman who had spent a lifetime tidying up far more than just laundry. Mrs. Beaumont did not move, her posture so rigid she appeared carved from the very Highland granite that formed the foundations of St. Mary's. Behind her, the blizzard had intensified, casting long, erratic shadows across the clinical office as the wind buffeted the glass. Blair, oblivious to the silent duel of gazes, let out a triumphant grunt as he fished the gold cufflink from its hiding place. He held it up to the light, his chest puffing out with a pride that was entirely unearned. "Well, well," Blair sneered, though his triumph was momentarily confused. "It seems your groundskeeper was a thief and a murderer," He must have stashed this here when he broke in, hoping to frame the staff. Clever, but not clever enough for a Strathbane detective. "Sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a deceptive, low drawl that masked his mounting frustration with Blair's stupidity. If Archie had the wit to frame the matron, he'd have the wit to stay away from the hotel bar where 40 people could swear to his location, and he certainly wouldn't have been able to operate that steam press. It requires a specific sequence, a code known only to the senior staff to override the safety sensors for heavy blankets. Nurse Higgins was a stickler for that code. She changed it every Monday. Mrs. Beaumont finally spoke, her voice as dry and brittle as dead heather. "The constable is quite right, Inspector. The machine is complex, and while I am shocked to see Mr. Henderson's property in my office, I can only assume Nurse Higgins put it there. She was a deeply troubled woman, prone to hoarding and erratic outbursts. I was in the process of preparing a report on her conduct when this tragedy occurred." Hamish watched her closely. She was good, very good. She had the calm, detached air of someone who had spent years in the upper echelons of the nursing corps, where silence was often the most powerful tool of the trade. But Hamish had noticed something earlier that she hadn't yet realized he'd seen. He looked again at the wastebasket where the shredded memos lay. "Hoarding is a sad thing," Hamish agreed, sounding almost sympathetic, "but blackmail is a much nastier business. You see, sir," he turned back to Blair, who was looking increasingly annoyed at being lectured. "Mrs. Kennedy at the post office mentioned that the previous matron was a dear friend of Higgins. She was forced out quite suddenly to make room for Mrs. Beaumont, and I've been wondering why a woman with Mrs. Beaumont's impeccable London credentials would move to a remote village in the middle of a Sutherland winter." "It's a promotion," Blair barked. "Now, Macbeth, stop this nonsense. The cufflink is here, the suspect is in the van, and I've got a long drive ahead of me." "But it wasn't just jewellery Higgins was hoovering up," Hamish continued, ignoring the DCI's reddening face. "She was hoovering up information. Priscilla Halberton Smythe mentioned that Higgins had a habit of keeping ledgers, little black books on everyone's failures. I suspect she found out why Mrs. Beaumont really left London. Something about military hospitals down south, perhaps. A cleansing of the records that didn't quite take." Mrs. Beaumont's eyes flickered, a microscopic fracture in her icy composure. For the first time the cold military mask slipped, revealing a desperate, sharp-edged fear. She realized then that Hamish wasn't the slow-witted local Blair assumed him to be. He was something far more dangerous, a man who sat in the shadows and saw the truth in the things people didn't say. "Blackmail?" Blair echoed, the word finally penetrating his thick skull. He looked from the cufflink to the matron, his eyebrows knitting together. "Are you suggesting the nurse was squeezing the matron?" "I'm suggesting that the dragon finally bit someone who knew how to bite back," Hamish said. "Someone who valued order so much they couldn't allow a blackmailer to stain their new life. The murder was not about gold. Gold was just Higgins's hobby. The murder was about a past that wouldn't stay buried. And that green smudge on the floor, it wasn't plant food. It was the residue from the specialized cleaning solvent Mrs. Beaumont uses for her surgical instruments. It's the only thing that would remove the grease from the press's gears without leaving a scent of oil." The room grew very still. Even Blair seemed to sense the mood shift. Mrs. Beaumont didn't deny it. She simply stood there, her hands clenched at her sides, the wind howling outside like a pack of hungry wolves. Hamish knew the motive was petty and human, the desire to protect a reputation at any cost. Now all he had to do was make her prove it. Hamish watched the flicker of uncertainty in Mrs. Beaumont's eyes and decided it was time to play his final, most deceptive card. He knew Blair was seconds away from losing patience and dragging everyone, guilty or innocent, back into the snowy night, so he let out a long theatrical yawn and scratched the back of his neck. "Of course, sir," Hamish said, his voice returning to a thick, sluggish Highland burr. "I'm likely just seeing ghosts in the peat smoke. Mrs. Beaumont is a lady of high standing, and it's a terrible thing to be cast aspersions. In fact, I'm so sure I'm wrong, that I think we should just let the matter of the second ledger rest until the morning. It's probably still hidden exactly where Nurse Higgins said she'd put it, in the secret compartment of the laundry room's main fuse box. Mrs. Beaumont's gaze sharpened instantly. The mention of a second ledger acted like a jolt of electricity through her rigid frame. Hamish continued, looking entirely oblivious to her reaction. She told the kitchen maid that if anything ever happened to her, the truth of the southern hospitals was tucked behind the high-voltage switch. I was going to check it myself, but with the storm and the DCI's clever arrest of Archie, it seems a bit redundant, doesn't it, sir? We wouldn't want to get our hands greasy for nothing. Blair snorted, already moving toward the door. Exactly. Always chasing moonbeams, Macbeth. I've got the thief, I've got the motive, and I've got a warm bed waiting in Strathbane. You stay here and finish the paperwork. If you want to poke around in fuse boxes and get yourself electrocuted, be my guest. We're taking McLean in. Blair marched out of the office, his heavy footsteps fading as he headed toward the main entrance. Mrs. Beaumont remained for a heartbeat, her mind clearly racing. She gave Hamish a curt, icy nod of dismissal. I believe I shall retire to my quarters, Constable. It has been an exhausting day for us all. I assume you can find your own way out? Aye, matron. I'll just be having one last look around before I head home to my stew, Hamish replied, his expression a masterpiece of vacuous simplicity. He waited until he heard her door click shut down the hall, then he whistled for lugs. But instead of leaving, Hamish moved swiftly back toward the laundry room. He didn't turn on the lights. He knew the building's geography well enough to navigate the shadows. He reached the heavy metal door of the laundry facility and stepped inside, the air still damp and smelling of that peculiar metallic heat. He didn't go to the fuse box. There was no second ledger, and there certainly wasn't a secret compartment behind a high-voltage switch. It was a classic Highland gillies lure, designed to see if the fish would bite. He crouched behind a tall stack of industrial-sized linen hampers, his hand resting on Lugs's head to keep the dog silent. The minutes ticked by. Outside, the wind screamed against the stone, and the distant sound of Blair's police van driving away signaled that the manor was now isolated. Then, the silence of the laundry room was broken by the soft, rhythmic click of heels on the linoleum. A beam of light from a small pocket torch cut through the gloom. It bobbed across the stainless steel dryers, and finally came to rest on the massive grey metal casing of the main fuse box on the far wall. Mrs. Beaumont appeared in the circle of light, her military-style cardigan pulled tight around her. She looked frantic, her movements stripped of their earlier clinical grace. She reached for the heavy latch of the fuse box, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She didn't have a key, but she used a pair of surgical scissors to pry at the lock, desperate to find the evidence she believed Higgins had left behind to destroy her. "It's not there, matron," Hamish's voice drifted out of the darkness, calm and conversational. Mrs. Beaumont screamed, spinning around so violently she dropped the torch. It rolled across the floor, its beam illuminating Hamish as he stepped out from behind the hampers. He looked tall and strangely formidable in the shifting light, his lazy mask gone, replaced by the grim face of the law. "There is no ledger," Hamish said, his voice echoing, "but there is a woman standing in a restricted area trying to break into a locked cabinet to destroy evidence she thought would hang her. A woman who knows exactly how the power to this room works." Mrs. Beaumont's face twisted into something monstrous. She realized then that the stupid policeman had never been stupid at all. She had been tricked by the very arrogance she used to shield herself. With a snarl of pure, focused rage, she realized she had nothing left to lose. She didn't go for the scissors. She lunged for the heavy iron steam pipe wrench resting on the workbench beside her. The iron wrench was a heavy blackened thing, more a blunt instrument than a tool in Mrs. Beaumont's trembling hand. The clinical mask had been entirely discarded now, replaced by the raw, jagged desperation of a cornered predator. She didn't look like a matron of a prestigious London clinic. She looked like a woman who had already spent a lifetime burying her mistakes, and was prepared to bury one more in the damp shadows of the Highland night. "You think you've been so clever, Macbeth," she spat, her voice echoing off the stainless steel surfaces. "Dragging me down into the mud with these peasants. Do you have any idea what I sacrificed to get away from that wretched hospital in the south? What did I do to ensure my record was spotless?" Hamish didn't move. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his eyes never leaving hers. Luggs gave a low, rumbling growl, his hackles rising like a line of jagged gorse. "I imagine you did a fair bit of cleaning, matron. But the problem with cleaning is that there's always a bit of dust left in the corners. Nurse Higgins was a professional at finding that dust. She didn't want your money, she wanted your power. She wanted to be the one pulling the strings at St. Mary's, and you couldn't have that, could you?" "She was a parasite," Beaumont screamed, then she jumped. For a woman of her age, she moved with a surprising military-trained precision. The wrench whistled through the air, aimed directly at Hamish's temple. But Hamish Macbeth was not the slow-witted creature she had underestimated. He moved with a feline agility born of years of climbing crags and dodging the sudden, violent shifts of the Highland weather. He stepped inside her guard, catching her wrist with a grip that felt like a closing trap of iron. "That's enough, matron," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a hard, crystalline tone that brooked no argument. "The game is finished." She struggled with a frantic, wiry strength, trying to bring the wrench down on his head, but Hamish used his height and weight to pin her against the massive frame of the steam press, the very machine she had used to silence the dragon. The irony was not lost on either as the cold metal pressed against her back. "Let go of me, you red-headed savage!" she hissed, her face inches from his. "Blair has already arrested the groundskeeper. He's halfway to Strathbane. No one will believe a word you say. You're nothing but a village joke." "Aye," Hamish said softly, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "I am a joke to people like you, and that's exactly why you're currently being recorded." He reached into his greatcoat pocket with his free hand and pulled out a small, battery-operated tape recorder, the kind the local minister used to record his sermons. It had been sitting on the laundry hamper, its little red light glowing steadily through the confrontation. The fight seemed to drain Mrs. Beaumont all at once. The wrench clattered to the floor, the heavy iron ring echoing through the room like a funeral bell. She slumped against the press, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The realization that her own arrogance had led her straight into a lazy man's snare was more crushing than any physical restraint. "Why?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Why did you care? She was a thief and a blackmailer. The village is better off without her." "Maybe so," Hamish replied, his voice returning to its gentle, melodic burr. "But the law in Loch Dhu doesn't come out of a steam press, matron. It comes from the truth. And I find I have a very low tolerance for people who try to make the Highlands as messy as the cities they've fled." He reached for his handcuffs, the cold steel clicking into place with a finality that seemed to hush the wind outside. He knew what would happen next. Blair would return, furious at being proven wrong, and Hamish would have to find a way to let the DCI take the glory without being dragged into a promotion himself. But for now, in the quiet, humid air of the laundry room, there was only the sound of a woman's quiet sobbing and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a dog who knew the hunt was over. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the damp laundry room, sounding the final note of Mrs. Beaumont's career. Hamish stood for a moment, letting the heavy silence of the room settle. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a familiar, nagging worry. He looked at the broken woman slumped against the machinery and then at the tape recorder in his hand. If he marched her out now and claimed the capture, the superintendent in Strathbane would be delighted. He would be hailed as the genius of the Glens, and within a month he'd be sitting in a cramped office in Inverness surrounded by concrete, car exhaust, and the endless soul-crushing chatter of a city precinct. "No," Hamish whispered to Luggs, who was watching him with intelligent, soulful eyes. "We can't have that, can we, boy? That would be the end of the fishing and the peace." He reached for the telephone on the laundry room wall and dialed the local frequency for Blair's radio. He knew the DCI would be only a few miles down the road, likely already drafting a press release in his head about his brilliant arrest of Archie McLean. "Inspector Blair?" "It's Macbeth here," Hamish said, pitching his voice into a tone of high-pitched, frantic distress. "You must come back at once. It's a miracle, sir, a total miracle. I was just doing the final check like you ordered, following your brilliant theory about the internal accomplice. And I stumbled right into the matron. She was trying to destroy the evidence you pointed out. I only just managed to hold her until you could get back to take charge." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end, followed by the sound of Blair barking orders to his driver to pull a U-turn so violently the tires screeched. 20 minutes later, the blue lights were flashing against the stone walls of St. Mary's once again. Blair burst into the laundry room, his face a magnificent shade of imperial purple. He took one look at the handcuffed Mrs. Beaumont, the iron wrench on the floor, and the tape recorder Hamish was clumsily trying to operate, and he swelled with a pride that nearly burst the buttons of his overcoat. "I knew it!" Blair roared, sweeping into the room like a conqueror. "I told you, Macbeth. I told the guys in the van the groundskeeper was just a distraction. I knew the matron was the real shark in these waters. My psychological profile of her was spot on." "You did well to follow my lead, man. Very well indeed." "Oh, it was all your doing, sir," Hamish said, bobbing his head with a vacant, admiring grin. "I'd never have thought to look at her if you hadn't mentioned the military precision of the crime earlier. I just sat here like a stone and waited, just like you suggested. It's a masterstroke, sir. The papers will have a field day with your Operation Steam Clean." Blair preened, his chest puffing out so far he looked like a prize-winning pigeon. He snatched the tape recorder from Hamish's hand as if it were a royal scepter. "Quite right. Operation Steam Clean. I like the sound of that. Right, lads, get her in the van. And let that McLean fellow go. Tell him he's lucky I'm a merciful man who values the truth over a quick conviction." Hamish watched as they led the silent, defeated Mrs. Beaumont away. Blair didn't even look back at the laundry room. He was already on his mobile phone, likely calling the Strathbane Gazette to ensure his name was spelled correctly in the front page headline. The other constables gave Hamish a sympathetic, knowing look. They knew who had done the work, but they were happy enough to have a boss in a good mood. As the last of the police cars disappeared into the swirling Highland snow, the silence returned to St. Mary's. The Sassenach order had been shattered, the dragon was gone, and the village had once again proven to be a place where outsiders' secrets eventually drowned in the mist. Hamish whistled for lugs, his mind already turning toward the small comforts of home. "Come on, boy," Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, contented lilt. "Blair has his glory, the matron has her cell, and we have a date with a very large salmon and a very hot stove. The case was closed, the credit was shifted, and most importantly, PC Hamish Macbeth remained exactly where he wanted to be, the unimportant, lazy policeman of a village that everyone else forgot." The drive back to the village was a slow, rhythmic journey through a world that had finally begun to settle. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a thick blanket of white that muffled the sound of the Land Rover's engine and turned the familiar crags into ghostly, rounded shapes. Hamish drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching out to pat Lugs's head. The dog was snoring now, a low, guttural sound that matched the hum of the tires on the slushy road. Behind them, the lights of St. Mary's faded into the dark, the grand Victorian structure looking less like a prestigious clinic and more like an old, tired monument to the folly of human ambition. By the time Hamish reached his small police station, the clock in the village kirk was striking midnight. The village of Lochdu was asleep, the only signs of life being the faint orange glows of peat fires behind thick cottage walls and the distant, rhythmic shush of the Atlantic against the harbour stones. Hamish stepped out of the vehicle, breathing in the air. It was sharp, clean, and entirely devoid of the industrial lavender and sterile chemicals that had defined his day. Inside the station, the air was chilly, but it took only a few moments for Hamish to revive the peat stove, He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his movements stripped of the lazy exaggeration he had performed for Blair. He filled a heavy iron pot with water and set it on the stove, then reached into the larder for a thick slab of bacon and a tin of coffee. The ritual of preparing a meal in the middle of the night was one of his greatest pleasures. It was a time when the demands of the crown and the noise of the world couldn't reach him. "We did well, lugs," Hamish murmured, as the scent of sizzling fat began to fill the room. "The dragon is at peace, the matron is where she can't tidy up any more lives, and Archie McLean is likely sleeping off his fright in his own bed. And best of all, Blair thinks he's the hero of the century." He pulled a crumpled copy of an old newspaper from the woodbox to help start the fire, catching a glimpse of a headline about a promotion in the Inverness district. He smiled to himself, a dry, sceptical Highland smile. Let Blair have the headlines, let him have the medals and the stress and the heart-pounding pressure of the city. Hamish wanted nothing more than the right to walk his dog, to catch the occasional salmon, and to be the man who sat quietly enough to hear what the wind was saying. As he sat down at the small wooden table, a plate of eggs and bacon steaming before him, the telephone gave a single tentative half-ring before falling silent. It was likely a crossed wire, or perhaps the superintendent trying to reach Blair, but Hamish didn't even look at it. He was currently a man of leisure, a village bobby who had stumbled his way into a solved case and was now far too tired to be bothered by official business. He thought of Priscilla, probably sleeping soundly at the castle, and wondered if she'd buy him a drink at the hotel tomorrow to celebrate his luck. She would know the truth, of course, and her knowing was enough. It was the only recognition he ever truly valued. The silent acknowledgement from someone who saw through the mask and liked the man underneath anyway. The fire crackled, a spark jumping against the iron grate. Hamish leaned back, his stomach full and his mind finally at rest. The undercurrent of darkness that had swept through Loch Dhu with the arrival of the Sassenachs had been pushed back, at least for a little while. The Highlands had a way of absorbing people like Mrs. Beaumont and Nurse Higgins, turning their grand dramas into nothing more than a bit of gossip to be shared over a drama in the winter months. He finished his coffee, the last of the heat warming his throat. Tomorrow he would have to deal with the paperwork, the endless forms that Blair would inevitably dump on his desk, and the frantic phone calls from Ponsonby Smythe about the reputational damage to St. Mary's. But tomorrow was far away. For now there was only the warmth of the stove, the weight of the dog at his feet, and the profound, beautiful silence of a Highland night. Hamish Macbeth closed his eyes, a contented man in a world that for once was exactly as it should be. The following morning the sun broke over the peaks of Ben Hope, turning the fresh snow into a blinding sheet of diamonds. In the Loch Dhu Hotel the breakfast room was a hum of hushed, frantic excitement. The early edition of the Strathbane Gazette had arrived, and there, splashed across the front page, was a photograph of a red-faced DCI Blair pointing imperiously at the industrial laundry wing of St. Mary's. The headline read, "The Silent Steam, Blair Cracks Nursing Home Killing." Hamish Macbeth, leaning against the bar and nursing a large mug of Mrs. McLean's strongest coffee, read the article with an expression of profound, wide-eyed wonder. My, Hamish murmured to the room at large. "It says here that Blair utilized advanced psychological profiling to trap the matron. I had no idea I was watching such a master at work. I thought we were just standing in the dark." Archie McLean, who had been released from custody with a very large and very free glass of whiskey as compensation for his ordeal, gave Hamish a long, searching look. "He's a great man, the DCI, Archie said, his voice thick with a sarcasm that only a Highlander can truly master. "I'm sure he'll be promoted to the moon and leave us all in peace." The door to the hotel swung open, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped in, looking radiant in a green wool coat that matched the colour of the pines. She walked straight to Hamish, her eyes sparkling with a mirth that she didn't bother to hide. "I see you've managed to save your skin again, Hamish," she whispered, leaning in close enough for him to smell the faint scent of her perfume. "The superintendent called my father this morning. He's so impressed with the efficiency of the Loch station that he's decided it's perfectly managed as it is. No need for a sergeant, and certainly no need to move you to Inverness." "A mercy, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his gaze settling on the loch outside. "Inverness is a fine place, I'm sure, but I don't think Luggs has the constitution for city life. He's very sensitive to the exhaust fumes." "And the matron?" Priscilla asked, her voice turning serious. "The rumour is she confessed to everything." "Aye," Hamish said softly. Once she realized the DCI had found that tape recorder she thought I'd hidden, she realized her military record wouldn't save her. She told them about the hospital in London, how she'd covered up a series of medical errors to keep her pension. Higgins knew it all. The dragon was a blackmailer, but the matron was a woman who had forgotten that the first rule of nursing is to do no harm. He finished his coffee and set the mug down with a definitive clink. He had a few more forms to fill out, the unimportant bits that Blair couldn't be bothered with, and then he had a date with a riverbank. As he walked out of the hotel, Lochdu village felt like it had breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Sassenach shadow had lifted, leaving behind only a bit of extra work for the local solicitors and a legendary story for the postmistress to recount for the next decade. Hamish whistled for Luggs, who was currently investigating a very interesting frozen puddle near the harbour. "Come on, boy," Hamish said, his lanky frame silhouetted against the bright winter sun. "The world is at peace, the DCI is a hero, and if we're lucky, that salmon is still waiting for us under the bridge." He walked down toward the water, his gait slow and deceptive, the very picture of a lazy Highland policeman. But as he gazed at the mountains, his eyes were sharp and clear. He had kept his home, he had kept his quiet, and in the Highlands that was the greatest victory of all.